and Air Noland also won the Atlanta Regional. What did he show you at Elite 11?
I was really impressed with Air Noland. I don't think he was quite good enough to win the whole thing, but if you had asked me to pick out a top three or a top five in my MVP voting, which I didn't get a vote, but I'm just saying, hypothetically speaking, Air Noland would have been in there. I thought he throws the ball so well, and now he does benefit from being the only left-handed guy there, kind of that, lefty jump shooter where it just looks a little prettier. It's kind of the same thing with the way Air Noland can throw the ball, but I was super impressed with his pro day circuit. And what I mean by the pro day circuit is on day two, they essentially go through a throwing script like you would see if you've ever watched the NFL scouting combine. And so it's rollouts, it's bootlegs, it's deep passes, it's timing routes, all that kind of stuff. But this course that they had was, or the script that they used rather, was built for right-handed quarterbacks because 19 of the 20 guys were right-handed quarterbacks. So when you had all these guys, bootlegging out to their right and throwing in a normal motion, you had Air Noland having to throw across his body on a bunch of these throws. And was it perfect? No, but it was still really impressive considering he was basically operating through this obstacle course backwards, if you will. And so I was really impressed with him and speaking with him and the way he talks and the way he describes Ohio State and how he thinks that they can develop him. I was very impressed with his maturity. So Air Noland is a name that I didn't know a ton about other than who he was going into this event, but one of the guys that I came away most impressed with based on his combination of on-field performance and sort of off-field intangibles, if you will.
We've talked about the two quarterbacks that are committed to the dominant programs in the SEC, Julian Sayin to Alabama, Dylan Raiola to Ohio State, and we've touched, or excuse me, to Georgia, Air Noland to Ohio State, and we kind of touched on what the Big Ten is representing there. But I would be remiss if I did not ask, how did Jadyn Davis look to you, especially knowing he got an at-large bid to Elite 11 in Redondo?
Yeah, that was one of the storylines I was most interested in following because at the Atlanta Regional, it was Air Noland from Ohio State against Jadyn Davis from Michigan, and it was Air Noland, the four-star commit, getting the better of Jadyn Davis, the five-star commit, to earn that automatic invite like you talked about. And so Jadyn Davis got one of these discretionary invites, and there were some times when he looked unbelievable in the 7-on-7. He really lit it up on Friday morning. But on Thursday night and Friday night, excuse me, on Wednesday night and Thursday night, he had his struggles. The first night, they essentially go through a routes on air situation. And then the second night is that pro day circuit that I talked about. And so, he kind of is developing this reputation of a gamer, a guy who, when the lights are on and it's time to play some football, he can get you from point A to point B and he can do it with, some flair and some pizzazz. But in some of the more technique-based stuff, he struggled a little bit. And he does have a pretty elongated motion. I think because he is shorter, he has to kind of really whip his arm around to generate some of the velocity that some of these other quarterbacks have a little bit more naturally, especially the taller ones, with Jadyn Davis being, a shade under 6'1". And so I think for him, it was probably not quite as well as he wanted to perform. But in the situation that he might have cared about the most, which was a game-like setting in 7-on-7, he showed up when the lights were on and did his thing and showed why Michigan made him its top priority in the 2024 recruiting cycle.
Looking at these guys that are committed to these Big Ten programs and these SEC programs in particular, as we are fast approaching 16-team conferences in both of those leagues, the two dominant conferences in our sport, does it feel to you like one conference has an edge in committed quarterbacks after watching Elite 11?
Man, that's a really good question. I mean, I think by with the idea that Julian Sayin and Dylan Raiola were the top two kids, I guess you probably have to give it to the SEC by default. Alabama and Georgia duking it out there just as they basically have done at the top of the SEC standings for the last few years. But the one name that I'm kind of curious about from a Big Ten standpoint, I mentioned earlier was Ethan Grunkemeyer, and you talked about how C.J. Stroud kind of really built his name or built up his stock even more at one of these events. And Grunkemeyer has all these parallels to Drew Aller because when you think about Drew Aller, he was a three-star kid going into Elite 11 from the state of Ohio that basically had no interest from Ohio State and decided to commit to Penn State and blossomed so much that he developed into the number one quarterback in the country by some metrics. And Ohio State really wasn't a factor in that recruitment at all, even though they extended a late scholarship offer. Well, Ethan Grunkemeyer is from 15 minutes north of Columbus. The Buckeyes have basically ignored him altogether. He grew up a huge Ohio State fan. His mom played basketball at Ohio State, and he can't even really get a sniff from the Buckeyes and still doesn't have an offer from them. And instead, he's watched as first Dylan Raiola was committed to Ohio State before he backed away from that. And now Air Noland. And that's basically saying, okay, we don't want the kid from 15 minutes away. Let's go to Arizona for Dylan Raiola. And then when that doesn't work, let's go down south to Georgia for Air Noland. And so I was really impressed with just the way he handled himself on the field in terms of rising to the occasion as a low-rated 3-star recruit relative to the people around him. But then I asked him straight up, I said, has it been difficult for you to basically watch Ohio State go out and say, this kid from our backyard isn't good enough for us. We have to go other places. And the maturity with which he answered the question, I thought was so impressive. He said, look, Air Noland is a great quarterback. He's really, really good. And he fits that system and what they want to do almost perfectly. And that's okay, because maybe I didn't fit that system as well as I might have hoped when I was a young kid rooting for Ohio State. But I found a place in Penn State and offensive coordinator Mike Yurcich, who believe in me the way that they believed in Drew Aller. And I think that's the best fit for me. So I'm cheering for Air to have a great career, just like I'm hoping I have a great career. And I can't imagine having that level of self-awareness and sort of maturity as a 16 or 17-year-old kid when I was that age. So I was just really impressed with him on the field as a kid who rose to the occasion when not a lot of people expected him to do a whole lot in Redondo Beach, and then off the field, knowing he's going to face that question about Ohio State over and over again. He answers it in a very poised and mature way that is in no way bitter or frustrated at being passed over by the team he rooted for as a child.
We're getting closer and closer to the LeBron James take on quotes, which is, I'm going to be magnanimous here. And I'm seeing this really filter down to our teenage kids. And I'm going, man, I kind of miss Austin Kendall saying we're going to smoke Ohio State, because it just gave me something else to talk about. But I get it. I understand. For someone to perform that level of maturity at that age is uncommon, and frankly, probably belies his performance and what they're getting at Penn State. Also sounds like a guy that's going to stay committed to Penn State come hell or high water, which is great news if you're in Happy Valley. I got to ask about the other quarterback committed to Georgia, because I'm just interested. Ryan Puglisi, do I have that correct?
I think it's Puglisi.
Puglisi. Okay, we'll go with Puglisi then. I'm a baseball guy. I love baseball. I go to the minor league ball game down the street in Tulsa all the time, see drillers play. I'm all for the College World Series. Look here, man. You tell me a guy's throwing 94 off the mound, and he's the second guy committed to Georgia. I got to know, what is making that guy go? And to your point, reading your piece at foxsports.com about 11 takeaways from Elite 11, he had to answer a lot of questions about Dylan Raiola. How did he answer them, and how did he take being the other guy committed to Georgia?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought him up, RJ. I was particularly interested in him as well because the school that he plays for, the prep school, Avon Old Farms, is about 15 minutes from where I grew up in Connecticut. So I'm very familiar with their campus. I've been there a number of times. And, just being from Connecticut in general, I'm aware that high school football in that state is by no means Florida, Georgia, Texas, Louisiana, California. They're not putting out a lot of highly rated prospects relative to those states, and especially not at the quarterback position, because Connecticut is still a state where running the football is essentially the identity of high school football. And so he was another kid alongside Raiola that physically looks like he could go into a game right now and at least hold his own and not worry about, breaking in half if he were to be sacked by somebody in the SEC. But this is a kid who was committed to Georgia long before Dylan Raiola entered the picture. He was committed in 2022, and then Raiola doesn't announce his verbal pledge until last month in about mid-May. And again, a kid who would basically in that moment have every opportunity to go somewhere else and say, man, the number one kid in the country is now committed to Georgia. Well, nobody's going to give me a sniff because this is Dylan Raiola. So maybe I should go somewhere else because I've got scholarship offers from everywhere in the country too. But he just said that he's fallen in love with Georgia. He's fallen in love with the culture that Kirby Smart has built and sort of the way that he can train football players from the mental side of things to be tough, to be winners, to develop into that national championship winning style program. And so I think for him, there's no doubt in his mind that he wants to stay at Georgia regardless of what happens with Dylan Raiola. And just as I was talking about how impressed I was with the way Ethan Grunkmeyer has answered questions about Ohio State, I think Ryan Puglisi deserves a tremendous amount of credit for putting up with the Dylan Raiola questions because, this kid was invited to the premier quarterback event in the country and essentially 50-60% of questions he gets asked are about another guy that's committed to his school, even though he's very clearly one of the best players in the country at his position. And so that's a very difficult spot to be in. And he said, look, I only get annoyed if the same person asks me the same question over and over again. He said, but if a bunch of different people are interviewing me and they all ask me about Dylan Raiola individually, I can't fault them for that. But if you start, really forcing it, he said that's when it starts to get a little frustrating. But I don't think the two of them are best buddies or anything like that, but they don't have to be. As long as they're friendly, as long as they respect each other, they're going to compete. And Puglisi's looking forward to competing. And Raiola said the same thing. He's looking forward to competing against Puglisi when they get to Athens. So, look, the kid can sling it. He got voted, I think, by On3 as the biggest gunslinger in the group, meaning when it's on, it's really, really good. And when it's off, there's some Brett Favre to it, where he's going to throw a few interceptions here and there. But no, I agree. If you're throwing 94 off the mound and you're built physically and you're going to a school like Georgia and you have if you have the stones to be willing to compete with Dylan Raiola and not get scared when that kid commits to your school, that's a tough-minded kid that I could see why Kirby Smart likes him.
Thank you for watching the #1 college football show. Please remember to subscribe to the channel and like this video so that you don't miss any of the best college football coverage in America.